All right. I think we're ready. So, welcome back, everybody. I'm good to see everybody. Thank you for being part of the call again, part of the class again. Um, this has been and I'm thrilled that we still have, so many people who have been, now I'm starting to see repeat people coming. So it means that you're really getting the full, rich and expansive version of the history of Israel. And we're so appreciative once again for Ori. As I like to joke, a more civilized hour for him today. On Sundays, it's civilized. On Wednesdays, it's uncivilized. He is broadcasting or zooming from Modi'in, which is in Israel, halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And Uri, as I've said, but this again just is for those who may be coming for the first time. Uri is a master educator, product of the Reform movement, and joined me and members of Temple Beth Shalom on a trip this year in Israel as he led us during, I would hardly refer to it as a tour, but rather more of just an experience being in Israel and connecting with our people. And Ori was there with us, kind of holding our hand as we did so. So we're so fortunate to have Ori here. As a reminder, we are streaming, just in case you are. And when I say streaming, I also mean recording. Just so there is, just be careful. If you have to pick your nose, or be careful if the phone rings. And I've muted most people, but not. In fact, I'm going to remute everybody, and then or you'll just unmute yourself. Um, just a two last two words. Number one is that I see Jeff Weintraub finally made it on the call. I'm so glad. I feel awful because Jeff was here at Temple Beth Shalom when I walked in, and I feel bad. So Jeff, sorry for the that you slept all the way out here, but I'm glad you made it on. And lastly, we people have been generous with us to help sponsor this session or this group of sessions. And so to those who have sent in something, I'm really grateful. If anyone wants to make a contribution to help offset the costs of this program, that'd be great. But I'm so grateful to those who have already done so. Ori, you're up, my friend.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's good to see everyone, and thank you for being here Sunday morning. I appreciate it. And again, I appreciate not because you need my accolade, but because it's just nice to be with like-minded folks on a Sunday. I just want to say I apologize in advance if you hear some coughing or some sipping of tea. I'm a little bit under the weather, but we should do fine. It's easier to do it this way than standing in front of an actual physical classroom and also have a cough. So I'll put that out there. We're going to jump right in and see how far we go as we've been building and building and building, and we'll take it from there. Oh, Rabbi, can you make me a co-host, please? Okay, thank you. Oh, and I noticed you were able to figure out the beeping sound, the doorbell ring, because it hasn't been ringing on my end. So whatever you did, it worked. Take the win.
I'll take the win.
There you go. Okay. So last week, we actually saw this watershed moment in real time as we traversed that line between pre-state and post-state. When I say post-state, I don't mean after the ending of the State of Israel, but the founding of the State of Israel. And we were able to come right up to the end of the Six-Day War, if you remember. And it's at that point that we want to begin essentially where we left off. And as I titled this Evolving as a Nation, I did so because it's really going to be from this time that we begin to mature as a modern state, mature as a people trying to figure out what it is they're looking for, what do we hope for, beyond those initial demands of ourselves leading up to the founding of the state, and the aftermath, to create a safe haven for the Jewish people, to create once again a physical connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel, now the state of Israel in modern times after 2,000 years of yearning to return. 3, let's not destroy ourselves and let's not be destroyed by our neighbors. And ultimately, how do we begin to thrive in our homeland once again? Meaning that is, I think, the general insight that we may have had leading up to the founding of the state and the immediate aftermath. Really, because we didn't have any time to think otherwise, meaning we wanted to survive, we wanted to take care of ourselves, and we didn't have any time to breathe. Oh, there's the beeping sound. Sorry. Either way,
I reject the win now, I guess.
there you go. Either way, we find ourselves at a point where it seems as if we've achieved it all, that we've gone to the mountain and we've received once again those tablets, and it seems as if we are on the right track. So we are going to match up our perspective of what we hope to achieve now and the reality that unfolds. After we saw our own internal debate and conversation, as it were, between Jerusalem of gold and Jerusalem of iron, if you remember, that's how we ended last time. The Arab world was not sitting on their laurels. That's the saying, I believe. Sometimes I have these sayings in my head, and even though I sound like this, I sometimes speak or I say things that my accent should sound like this. And of course, I'm Israeli and my English not so good, very, very. So you'll have to bear with me there. But you know what I mean, either way. And as the Arab world gets together in the immediate aftermath of the 6-Day War, they will convene a meeting in Khartoum in North Africa. And while much is discussed there, the essence of what they discuss produces what will be known as the 3 infamous no's: no peace, no recognition, and ultimately, no negotiations whatsoever with the Jewish state, with Israel. If we thought in the aftermath of that 6-Day War that the Arabs would finally come to the table, and when I say the Arabs, I'm speaking about the Arab countries which surround us, so that we have to be aware that sometimes we use generalizations in the wrong context, and sometimes we use it in the right context. In this sense, that is the Arab world, and also Persia, Iran, because it was really the Muslim world, refused to have any kind of negotiations. So from our end, it seemed not to be a problem. Why? Because Moshe Dayan, the Minister of Defense, says very clearly, our hands are always open to peace. If the Arabs want peace, they have to call us. Now, we might say that that sounds somewhat militaristic and not so altruistic. However, I think we have to understand the statement within the realm of all of the experience that has led Moshe Dayan, not to mention the state of Israel and the Israelis living in it, how that has informed them of their reality. We're willing for peace, but if the Arabs want, now it's on them to call. That same Moshe Dayan, by the way, was also very adamant during the 6-Day War, at the very end, in this very famous line or words that were shared over the military radio, the radio machines amongst the soldiers. Uzi Narkis is sitting on the Temple Mount. Sorry, he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, looking across to the Temple Mount, the old city, and he hears the very famous words of the soldiers, Ha Habayit Be'adenu, the Temple Mount is in our hands. And soon after that, some Israeli soldier will actually climb to the top and place an Israeli flag on top of the Dome of the Rock. And it's going to be Moshe Dayan's instructions to remove it immediately. And while there was some call here in Israel to destroy and to blow up the Dome of the Rock, so that once and for all, we can share with the world that we are here to stay, and the Arab world, no matter how long they try and destroy us, they will not succeed. Now, on the one hand, in the aftermath of the 6-Day War, it could very well be that the world would have sat on the sidelines and said, okay, we understand Israel was facing a second Holocaust, and it's time the Muslim world recognized that. However, other heads prevailed, as far as calmer heads, and said that's what they do, because in fact the Jordanians blew up several synagogues in the old city, including the Hurva synagogue, which since 2007 has been rebuilt. It stands there in the center of the Jewish quarter, but it was a symbol of their victory. And we instituted something called the status quo, in which the Muslims would be in charge, along with the Jordanians, actually, of their holy sites. And that included, obviously, the Temple Mount, or as they would call it, Haram el-Sharif. This is what Israel did, and it's interesting to see whether that was a good decision or not a good decision in the context of the history that unfolds. And in a few sessions' time, when we're already talking about the war at hand, we can talk a little bit about the actions of Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the Minister of Internal Security, inclined to generate as much foot traffic as possible in prayer by Jews on the Temple Mount. Now, if our hopes for peace with the Arab world fell apart, that war came a lot faster than we thought, in that we would spend now about 1.5 to 2 years in what would be called a war of attrition. In the aftermath of the Six-Day War, Israel, as I mentioned, was a felt on top of Olympus, and that we were, in fact, as strong as we imagined we could be. Even if we were preparing for the worst, this dream seemed to materialize as the last verse of the song, Jerusalem of Gold, shared with us. And Moshe Bar-Lev, who is the chief of staff in the aftermath of Yitzhak Rabin, Bar-Lev is going to go ahead and, ultimately say, we are strong enough that all we need is a series of outposts along our borders, whether along the Sinai Peninsula or even up on the Golan Heights, between the border with Syria or with the border with Egypt. And you can see clearly here that these outposts were enough of a deterrence, so we thought, to our Arab neighbors, especially Egypt, who, while it spoke about leading the Arab world, they would not be ready to attack us. And instead of a full-on war, they began to bombard these outposts. And you can see the outcome on the screen of what happened along the Bar-Lev line. It was also during this time that the Soviets are going to very heavily double down on backing the Arab world and replenishing any weaponry that they might need, training, etc. As such, we begin to see the process of Israel and its neighbors becoming pawns in a much greater war, of course, the Cold War, which was producing, among other things, the war in Vietnam. As if the Soviets are going to back the Arab world, then America is going to get behind Israel. Now, this isn't to say that America wasn't always in Israel's corner. We know minutes after the United Nations says yes to a partition plan, the United States was the first to go ahead and recognize the new state of Israel. And there had been a real strong connection from the very beginning. But in the Six-Day War, our weapons were mostly not from America. Our planes were French, our tanks were British, our guns, some of them were from Belgium, meaning it wasn't really until after the Six-Day War that we begin to see America recognizing here is a player that we can get behind. So on the one hand, there is the shared values, the altruism, the connection that America has for all the right reasons with Israel. But we have to recognize also geopolitically that there's very few friends in the world. And in fact, there are mostly interests. And therefore, those two went hand in hand. This, of course, was the outcome of the war of attrition, with almost 1,000 Israelis killed over the course of almost 2 years. And then at a certain point, there was a ceasefire that would be imposed by the Soviets and America and the United Nations. Now, in the early 1970s, a few things are going to occur, and we're going to share them now, not necessarily in their immediate order, but close enough. What we see here is the Israeli team marching in Munich in 1972 at the Olympics. And I bring this as another example of the fact that the Arab world did not put down its arms, and that it continued to attack Israel wherever they may be. Now, I'm sure you all know where this is going, and you remember that the outcome of those Olympics, the same Olympics that Mark Spitz won all of those medals, that there were 11 Israeli fatalities as they were killed by terrorists who had taken over the Olympic Village, and then transfer the Israeli athletes to 2 helicopters that were at the local airport in Munich. There was also a German police officer who was also killed. But this reality, from what I understand, was able to create a moment of silence, and then the games went on as nothing happened. And therefore, there is a challenge that we have with the world's response, even though at that point, and we're not going to get so much into this, the prime minister at the time, Golda Meir, made it very clear that each one of those involved in the attack we would find them, which ultimately we did. But this was one example of the ongoing terror that was happening against Israel. And just to remind us, there are those, in fact, who say that the Six-Day War is what created terrorism, and that there was occupation, and therefore the response to that is terrorism. I had mentioned earlier on the area of the West Bank of the Jordan River, which comes under Jordanian control in the aftermath of the War of Independence. And we talked about what the Green Line was. But that West Bank already now becomes titled very differently depending from your political, ideological background. And whether it's the West Bank or it is Judea and Samaria, and we'll talk about that in a moment, or the occupied territories, this is going to be something which there are those who would claim is the reason for terrorism. Now, this may or may not be the case. However, let's just remind ourselves that up until 1967, there were about more than 1,000 Israelis who were killed in terrorist attacks on cross-border raids. And the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and if I go back for a moment, I will tell you that this Palestinian Liberation Organization was going to have an a branch of it would break away and would call itself Black September. Now, why did it call itself Black September? Is that, first of all, the PLO itself was founded in 1964, which is the first time that Yasser Arafat is going to perpetrate an attack against Israel. But this branch of the PLO, to be known as Black September, will name itself Black September because in 1970, so 2 years before the Olympics, Yasser Arafat is marching around Jordan as if he owns the country. And he has his own army, as the majority of people living in Jordan, even at that point, are going to be Palestinians and not Jordanians. The ethnic Hashemite kingdom of Jordan is, in fact, a minority, like many Arab countries, of its in its own country. And therefore, King Hussein, who is the king of Jordan, doesn't like the fact that Yasser Arafat seems as if he thinks he owns Jordan. And therefore, in September of 1970, he will send his troops in to attack and to even slaughter Palestinians. In fact, there are multiple thousands of Palestinians who are killed by Jordan in 1970. Now, the Jordanians will talk about a few hundred, the Palestinians will talk about a few thousand. Maybe that number is less significant, and more significant is the fact that there's no love lost between the Jordanians and the Palestinians. Either way, the leadership will be kicked out of Jordan, and they make their way, eventually they end up in Lebanon via Syria. This attack in September of 1970 is what's going to generate the name Black September. But in 1971, so during all of this time, as I mentioned last time, we're not just about war to war to war. We also have internal issues as well. And if you remember, we spoke about the Ma'abarot, those transit tent cities that were there temporarily to house those immigrants who were coming from the Muslim world, the Jewish immigrants who were being kicked out of the Muslim world, countries in which they were living for 2,500 years. This group, while there were some explosion points along the way, would really erupt in 1971 with a grassroots movement known as the Black Panthers. It starts in the neighborhood of Musrara, which is just outside of the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. If you can imagine the Jaffa Gate, and you come out of the Jaffa Gate and you keep walking to the very end, to the corner of the wall before it takes a right down to Damascus Gate, if you cross the street diagonally in that area, that's the neighborhood of Musrara. So those were immigrants who had come to the state of Israel, were placed in a neighborhood that was the worst neighborhood to live in because the Jordanians were shooting across at will. And there was a real sense of them living in a second-tier citizenry. And in fact, they demanded that they weren't willing to be a second Israel any longer. And there were protests in the streets. You can see there's real ridicule of Golda Meir. Teach us Yiddish, Golda. Go ahead. Tell us how we're supposed to be civilized. And whether this is accurate or not, and it's believed that she actually never did say this, and yet this is the perception of what was said after a meeting between the leader of the Black Panthers and Golda Meir, that she said something along the lines of, they are nice, not nice children. They're not nice boys, meaning there was a real emasculation and also belittling of who the Black Panthers were. And of course, the sense of the injustice that was being perpetrated against them, which is actually true. They were, in fact, subjugated to that second-class citizenry, not officially, of course, but that's what was perceived, that in order to move up in the ranks within society, you had to be an Ashkenazi Jew. There seemed to be real movement in this process of social change, even with, for the first time, real violent demonstrations in the streets of Jews against Jews, of the Black Panthers against the police. And then all of that advancement came to a halt because of what happened on October 6, 1973. Now, some of you may even remember the beginning of what would be called the Yom Kippur War. This was a war that Israel never anticipated would happen. Why? Because we never thought that the Arab world so soon would be able to once again rebuild its capabilities and also have the wherewithal to think that they could really come together and destroy the Zionist entity, the state of Israel. Because they tried and they tried and they tried in the Six-Day War, and Israel showed them, even when we thought we were at our worst, we were able to deal with you. And this took Israel by surprise. Now, the truth is that in the year leading up to the Yom Kippur War, during 1973, there were a few moments in which there was ultimatums given by the Arab world. The Arab leadership at this point, Egypt and Syria primarily, are going to threaten Israel that if you don't remove all of your troops and your citizens from the West Bank and from the Sinai Peninsula, which Israel had come into control of, in the Six-Day War, we are going to destroy you. And earlier in the spring of 1973, all of our reserves are called up. And when that happens, all of our economy comes to a halt. This happens over the course of several months and nothing happens. And then we see that we slowly begin to release our reserve duty soldiers. The same ultimatum is going to be given in September of 1973. And once again, at this point, the chief of staff, David Elazar, Dado as he's called, is going to ask Golda, listen, it'd be great if we could have a full call-up or maybe a preemptive strike or something. It's not entirely clear what's happening across the border, and Golda is getting information from two different sources. First of all, the Mossad, Israel's CIA, remember what was originally the Mossad La'aliyah Bet, the organization or institution for clandestine immigration, is going to have the same information that Israeli military intelligence, or in Hebrew, the acronym is Aman, is going to have, and they're going to both read it very differently. The Mossad is going to say that it is, in fact, preparations for war, and the military intelligence is going to say that it's only training, and that, again, we are strong enough, and they are deterred enough, and they will never attack. And, of course, this all sounds very familiar. Then the Yom Kippur War starts. And when it does, it actually starts at 2 p.m., which is earlier than originally planned. And the reason it is because around midnight between the 5th and the 6th, which is already Yom Kippur day, Israel is aware finally that in fact there's going to be a full-on attack. And Israel at 6 p.m. the following day, that is the end of Yom Kippur, Israel gets on the airwaves and lets America know that we know that they're going to attack at 6 p.m., hoping that that calms everybody down. And instead, what it does is it causes the Arab world, Egypt and Syria, this time Jordan stays out of it. There's no love lost, not just between Jordan and the Palestinians, but Jordan and its neighbors as well. And they move it up to 2 p.m., which is exactly what happens. Now, along the way, we know that Dado once again asked for a full-on call-up so that we can preemptively attack. And Golda says, no, we can do a partial call-up of the tank corps at midnight to be able to move forward, because if we do a full-on call-up, it could be seen as an aggressive act. Then the Arab world will attack and will be blamed for the beginning of this war. Golda Meir, with all of her greatness, is being bombarded with information and direction from a cadre of generals and ministers who have in their own minds and perhaps actually practically a lot of military information experience, whether it's Moshe Dayan or Ariel Sharon and others. And at 2 p.m. on that fateful Yom Kippur day, the sirens around Israel sound. I think it was actually at 1:50 p.m. Now, one of the benefits of the attack taking place on Yom Kippur, perhaps unbeknownst to the Egyptians and the Syrians, is that we knew where to find people. Either they were in synagogue or they were at home. That was the reality on the ground until today. If you've been in Israel during the high holidays, you may know that on Yom Kippur, our roads are empty, even though the largest segment of Israeli society, something like 45%, identify themselves as secular Israelis. There still is a certain gravitas given to the day, and there's no cars on the road. For many who don't go to shul, it's really the bicycle and roller skate and skateboard day, because everybody takes to the streets. We're able to, therefore, very quickly locate people and get them up to their bases on the Golan Heights and down in the Sinai Peninsula. But what you can see here is the direction of the surprise attack, either from the Golan Heights, which will be subdued by what will become the largest tank battle in history since World War II, with just a handful of soldiers along what's called the Bar-Lev line. Sorry, not Moshe Bar-Lev, Chaim Bar-Lev. I made a mistake before. And you can see what happens on the Suez Canal. We were sure, we were so strong, and yet the Egyptians were able to traverse the Suez Canal and overcome our outpost. It was a devastating war, and yet it's a war that we won. How do I know we won? We won because we weren't annihilated. We weren't destroyed. There was no middle ground here. There was no, okay, we're just going to take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and call it a day. The Arab world was intent on destroying the Zionist entity and pushing us into the sea, as they like to say. The aftermath of the war indicates that we not only won, but unfortunately, we also lost. And why do I say we lost? We lost not because we weren't able to push the Syrians and the Egyptians back and even enter into their territory, making an active decision to come back to our borders as they were before the war began, because our intent was never to conquer another country. We lost because, well, several things. First of all, if we just look at the numbers, 2,700 Israeli soldiers were killed in this war. 2,700. Now, at a time, we were 3.5 million people. So if we want to understand that 2,700 plus the fact that 3 times that were wounded in these 3.5 weeks, there wasn't a family that wasn't affected in some way by this war. But I think if we look at the image on the screen right now and what Golda is doing, it could be that she was just exhausted, but also I think is reflective very much so of what was happening to us as a people. And we were shattered. Our sense of self, our sense of strength, our sense of our ability, our sense of what we thought our neighbors were willing and capable of doing, all shattered. They all collapsed. Now we were able to rebound and we were able to save ourselves. But this was a country that was struck unlike anything it had experienced and would affect it for 50 years, almost to the day. But we'll get to that. But it will inform everything that we do moving forward, even if it's not always at the forefront, meaning not everything is about the Yom Kippur War, but it will always be there and a reminder that those who will say that we want to destroy you, we should believe them. Now, the 1970s, and in particular, this war is going to produce a lot of excellent music, including what becomes iconic and very much connected to the war, always sung by Yoram Gaon, written by Chaim Hefer. Yoram Gaon, this quintessential voice of generations here in Israel, very much his voice loaned itself to our connotation of the Yom Kippur War. And if you read the lyrics, we'll hear the song being sung, at least part of it, I think in many ways reflected who we thought we were and what we hoped would be in the aftermath of the war.
אני זוכר כמעט שנה פניהם המאובקות אשר עברו את כל האש והשחיקות בשם הימאים אשר פשטו על הנמלים ועיניהם כבדות ממלח וגלים אני מבטיח לך ילדה שלי קטנה שזאת תהיה המלחמה האחרונה אני מבטיח לך ילדה שלי קטנה שזאת תהיה המלחמה האחרונה.
There was a real urgency with that line, those lines. I promise you, my little girl, that this will be the last war. There was such a real, authentic belief that this would be the case. Because even when we were at our worst, we were able to overcome. And if that's the case, the Arab world will finally realize that they cannot win a war against us. The 1970s, as they unfolded, would provide us with a whole new outlook on the world around us, but also internally of how we see ourselves. And this included an overlap of what was going on already in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. In the immediate aftermath of the Six-Day War and into the 1970s, now that the West Bank has come into Israeli hands, and again, that same West Bank, geographically speaking, the area outlined by the Green Line, would be known by different titles, either Judea and Samaria or the occupied territories. Each one of these titles would reflect in many ways where one stood politically, geopolitically, ideologically, religiously, if they knew what they're talking about. The reason Judea and Samaria was reflective of those who religiously, ideologically were more so found on the right wing of our political spectrum is because it was an indication that our understanding of the reclaiming of this land is one in which, once again, the Jews are going to return to their ancient homeland. This was our biblical ancestral stomping ground. The area of the West Bank. Why wouldn't a Jew, in the aftermath of everything we've achieved since 1948, not to mention 2,000 years of yearning, given the opportunity to live on the site where Jacob collects some rocks and has a dream when he sleeps with a ladder and angels going up and angels coming down, why wouldn't we take it? Why wouldn't we want to live in the vicinity of the matriarchs and patriarchs' final resting spot in what is known as the Machpelah Cave in Hebron? That's exactly why we are here to begin with. We did not return to the land to live in Haifa or to live in Jaffa or to live in Rishon LeZion. But this is the very essence of who we are as a people. We're not taking the land from anyone. We are returning to our ancestral, biblical, historical homeland. And of course, there are those who would claim that Israel occupied the area of the West Bank and therefore, in a very derogatory way, is responsible for removing itself because we're going to ignore for the fact that Israel was threatened with annihilation. However the case may be, it's not an area that belongs to Israel and therefore doesn't have control over it. Again, right wing, left wing. Now, for our purposes, my guess is we'll probably mostly refer to it as the West Bank as a more generic term, and yet even this geographic identifier can also be geopoliticized for anybody's benefit. Officially, the area of the West Bank is known by the United Nations as disputed territories. Now, as such, those Jews who were like-minded would go ahead and begin to build settlements or Jewish communities. Sometimes we use language that we know what it means, but it has attained for itself a certain representation of a political ideology, and therefore settlement could be seen in a positive light or a negative light. We can also just refer to it as what it is intended. If you open up Webster's dictionary and you think about the settlements that were created in the Wild West back in the 18th century in America, go west, young man. That's what it was. It was settlements that were created. Now, what is the reason for these settlements or Jewish communities beyond the Green Line? I would say there's probably three main reasons. The one reason we already mentioned is the historical, ideological, religious connection with the land, and therefore we want to live in the vicinity of those places. And in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, miracle of miracles is proof that God is still with us, and therefore we have an obligation to live out there. The second reason has to do with security, in that we remember the days of 1948 War of Independence, and there were times when single kibbutzim held off entire armies. Excuse me, whether it was the Egyptian army that was held off for 8 days by Kibbutz Yad Mordechai, which is just north of the Gaza Strip, and we were able to dig in just outside of the city of Ashdod in order to best prepare ourselves to stop the Egyptians from coming and attacking Tel Aviv, which we were successful doing, or Kibbutz Degania up in the north on the southwestern corner of the Sea of Galilee, was able to hold off the entire Syrian army and send them packing. So we remember that, and therefore there are those, and if you remember the area of the West Bank, you may know that it's an elevated ridge that is also identified as the spine of the country in many ways. And as such, the high grounds, whoever holds the high grounds is the one that is able to protect itself. And therefore, there are settlements for security reasons, so that not if, but when the Arab world attacks again, we will be prepared and the army can have its time to focus on whatever front it needs to focus on. And the third reason is going to be financial, actually, economic. And we'll get to that a little bit later as our story unfolds. But that's going on in the 1970s. In addition, the 1970s, as we're just trying to figure out how to be a nation amongst the nations, Israel wins a competition that, first of all, should be banned because we should never objectify anybody in this particular way. But in the 1970s, we are able to win the Miss Universe contest. This is unheard of. Little Israel's winning the Miss Universe contest. Also in 1976, Israel will show itself and the world that we can take care of ourselves as we reach beyond our borders and we do the unthinkable. To remind us, we know that in 1976, in late June, there was an Air France plane that was leaving Israel, landing in Greece, and from there to other destinations. And when it landed in Greece, terrorists got on board, both European and Palestinian terrorists, and they will hijack the plane, excuse me, that had on it Israelis, tourists who are Jewish and tourists who are not Jewish. The plane eventually is forced to land in Uganda, in the city of Entebbe, at an abandoned airfield. And very quickly, those non-Israelis and those without Jewish-sounding names will be separated and released, while the captain offers to stay with the hostages. There's going to be more than 100 Israelis who are kept behind. And the demand by the terrorist is for Palestinian terrorists in European and Israeli jails to be released. Yitzhak Rabin is the prime minister, as he will take over the reins of the Labor Party after the Yom Kippur War. Golda Meir at the helm of the Labour Party will actually win the elections, meaning the Labour Party will win the elections, and she at the helm will become prime minister. But what began as a single officer who had fought in the Yom Kippur War, standing in front of Golda Meir's home as protest, turned into a movement that would ultimately shake the political foundations of the Labour Party, demanding that people who were responsible for allowing the Yom Kippur War to happen to pay the price. And she will ultimately step down from her position as prime minister. And Yitzhak Rabin will take over after having returned from the United States after the Yom Kippur War, where he served as the ambassador to the United States. But it will be he who is prime minister at the time, and Shimon Peres, who is going to be the Minister of Defense, who will enter into negotiations, which we'd never done before, for the release of these hostages. But at the same time, we give the order to Sayeret Matkal, which is our most specialized anti-terrorist commando unit of the best in the world, similar to what you would know perhaps as your Delta Force. Yoni Netanyahu is the commander who is given the responsibility to prepare a raid that had never even been conceptualized before across enemy territory, and to land large Hercules C-137 transport planes on the tarmac of the abandoned airport. And eventually they made their way to the main terminal where the hostages were being killed. There was a firefight when they stormed the building. The hostages were saved, although there was one who was killed in the firefight, and there was another woman, Dora Bloch, who had left just a day or two earlier for treatment in a local hospital where Idi Amin's people killed her. He provided the peripheral security for the terrorist, which is interesting considering if you ever see a picture of Idi Amin, the head of Uganda at the time, he has on his epaulets or on his lapel, he has Israeli paratroop jump wings, because earlier on in the 1960s, Israel actually has a good relationship with Uganda, and actually we have the plans for the airport because Israeli engineers built the airport in the 1960s. Either way, the hostages, most of them are saved unbelievably. It really is a miracle, and the terrorists are killed. The hostages are put on the transport planes and they're flown back to Israel. There was one Israeli casualty, and that is Yoni Netanyahu. Later, the mission would be called after him, Operation Jonathan. If you were so inclined, I think you would find real inspiration from finding a book called Letters of a Hero. And these are a collection of the letters of Yoni Netanyahu that were written over the course of his life as he spent time. Of course, he's Israeli, but then his family moved to America. His father was a professor. And then he moved back here for his military service. Really a profound insight into a very powerful young man at the time. But we reach out and we save them. It's unheard of. And if this wasn't enough, the 1970s will also allow another David and Goliath moment for Israel, in which Israel will win the European Basketball Cup. This is unprecedented. A little country like Israel. This is not going to be the national team, but Israel's most excellent premier team, and that is Maccabi Tel Aviv. Maccabi Tel Aviv will have a captain whose name is Tal Brody. Tal Brody is originally from Trenton, New Jersey, where he played basketball with my dad, actually, when they were kids, but went on to the University of Illinois and was captain of the USA Maccabia team in the 60s. He then makes Aliyah, becomes captain of Maccabi Tel Aviv, and in 1977, after we win the European Basketball Cup, actually along the way in the semifinals, Israel beats the Soviet Union. So really, this is just phenomenal. And then the final, we're going to hear the iconic words that were shared by Tal Brody when he's interviewed. By the way, the American accent that you'll hear hasn't changed. He still has the same American accent from when he said these fateful words, and there's subtitles at the bottom so you can understand better if you don't understand the original Hebrew. We will hear the sports announcer, and we will hear Ralph Klein, who is the coach, and of course, and we'll end with Tal Brody.
טל ברודי, הגיע לך הרגע הזה. אני אגיד לך, כל שנה הגענו יותר קרוב, והשנה אנחנו עשינו, עבדנו בזה, תודה לכל העורכדים שלנו, הם היו פנטסטיים. קהל כזה, או עורכדים כאלה, שם אנחנו יכולים לעשות את הכל. כדורסל בארץ יש, אנחנו במפה, ואנחנו נשארים במפה, לא רק בספורט, והכל.
כדורסל יש בארץ, אנחנו נשארים על המפה, לא רק בספורט, בהכל, if I use my best American accent in Hebrew. We are staying on the map, not just in sports, in everything. Now, this was so profound. Till today, people will stop Tal in the street and ask him for that line. This really, I think, was an outpouring of Israel just realizing, you know what, maybe we've finally achieved what it is we want to achieve. Interesting enough, Maccabi Tel Aviv wins the world championship on the same day that Yitzhak Rabin resigns from the premiership. And the reason he resigns from the premiership is because his wife is going to be, Leah Rabin is going to be found to have a dollar account in the United States. At the time, it was illegal for Israelis to have dollar accounts. Now, what ultimately happened is they had an account in the States when they were ambassadors there, and they never closed it. Either way, Rabin takes responsibility and steps down. He takes responsibility. Now, later in the 1980s, he'll come back into politics, and we'll continue with him as he does. But it is interesting perspective, given what we know of what's happening today. That same year, 1977, is going to produce another major earthquake here. This will be on our political front. And I mentioned in the last couple of sessions, I think, that there was real animosity even between two major political players, and that is David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin, the head of the Labor Party, the head of the Likud Party. And the Labor Party had been the dominant party all the way up until May of 1977. From the pre-state period, what had been born out of the labor Zionist movement, we know that those early movements will produce the political parties. Likud, of course, is the evolution of this, the spiritual and political outcropping of, ideological outcropping of Jabotinsky. When the elections happen, there's going to be what's called a mahapach, a political upheaval. And you can see the political signposts that were plastered all around. Change the government. You can see Menachem Begin over here. In one case, his face is defaced. His picture is defaced over here. You can see a little black tooth there, and there isn't one here. There's a real tension within the people. And even though he was an Ashkenazi Jew, he is going to represent the underclass, or that very same second Israel, the second Israel that never had its day to really come out of that second classhood because of the Yom Kippur War. And we had other issues on the table, or so it was claimed. And the Mizrahi population of Israel very dominantly will put their vote behind the Likud party. And you can see the very solemn face of Chaim Yavin on the screen, who was known as Mr. Television. Israel didn't get TV until after the Six-Day War, and we only had one channel up until the early 1990s. So he was the voice you heard and very much represented the establishment. And with a very grave voice and deadpan look, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, a mahapach, a political upheaval." And as much as that perhaps on his face reflected his ultimate surprise that this could possibly happen, that the Labor Party would fall, you can see the rejoicing in the eyes of the constituents of the Likud party and Menachem Begin, who is on the one hand not religious but traditional in a sense, and very much reflected the ideology of those Mizrahi Jews. One of the first things that new government did, to the surprise of many, was to reach out to Egypt, Israel's arch enemy, and to reach out in order to achieve peace. Anwar Sadat, the head of Egypt, is going to, by the way, I'll just add that Egypt saw their what we saw as loss as a victory till today. What they call the October War was seen as a victory of what they were able to do to Israel. And Anwar Sadat is going to be invited by Menachem Begin in 1978 to Israel that will lead to 1979, the Camp David Accords that were orchestrated by Jimmy Carter. And there was such a fear that when Anwar Sadat landed at Ben Gurion Airport, Ben Gurion died in late 73, early 74, and that's when the name changed to the airport, that there were snipers on buildings around anticipating potentially a Trojan horse. Clearly that wasn't to be, and not only does he arrive, these two arch enemies, but he speaks at the plenum of the Knesset in Arabic. This is unheard of. Imagine if instead of announcing to the world that Osama bin Laden, we got him. Imagine if Obama said, we're inviting Osama bin Laden to speak and to address the Congress. That's as much of a shock as it would have been. And all Israel had to do for peace was to release, of course, the Sinai Peninsula. Now, there are those who say, wait a second, if we're going to release the Sinai Peninsula, we're going to do that after 2,700 were killed and 3 times that were wounded. How can we give up that strategic platform? The Sinai gives us the depth of defense that we need. And we can't trust the Arab world. They've proven again and again and again. And Israel says, no, we're able to do it. And we have assurances by America and the Arab world, et cetera, not the Arab world, but by Egypt. What Israel does get out of this is it becomes the country that receives the highest or the most amount of military aid by the United States, which on the one hand is true, but on the other hand is not true, because they're countries that receive actually more if you look at all the bases that they have on their countries, whether it's in Japan or other places. But for all intents and purposes, Israel becomes the recipient of the most amount of military aid in the aftermath of this agreement. Land for peace played out for the first time. Egypt becomes the country that receives the second most amount. Now, why did Egypt sign the deal? It wasn't just because of the money. It was also because it very much feared Israel. And there was a real fear that Israel, if it wanted to, could bomb the Aswan Dam and destroy Egypt. So this was an insurance policy, and it seemed to allow Anwar Sadat to become the savior that saves Arab integrity and pride. When this happens, the settlements that were already created in the immediate aftermath of the victory of the Yom Kippur War, the 6-Day War, are going to be forcibly removed because Israel has to remove all of its settlements from the area that's being returned. And you can see here, there are Israeli soldiers who are forcibly going to be removing Israelis from their rooftops because they're not willing to give up their land. This is a place that on the one hand is the ideal of Israeli sense of self, the pioneer pushing the boundaries and strengthening our land and protecting us on the periphery, and not to mention a certain ideology politically that we have to be able to rely on ourselves and to protect ourselves, and by giving this up, we're going to lose that, and therefore they were refusing to give up. And in this case, we have our trusty magnifying glass to show us once again and to focus on the fact that these were soldiers, Israeli soldiers against Israeli civilians. This was a terrible situation, and yet perhaps a reality that Begin had to ensure this peace agreement. Now, if we take a look on the images that we see on the screen, you can see the settlement of Yamit and where it's located on the map. You can see where Gaza Strip is, and you can see where Yamit was, right on the shores of the Mediterranean. And another example of Israeli soldiers having to physically remove Israelis from their home. There's one other thing that's going to happen in the 1970s that are really going to put Israel on the map. In fact, 2 different things. One is in 78 and one is in 79. So you can see that we're taking 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And that is Israel wins the Eurovision contest. Now, the Eurovision contest is one that the entire world knows, America a little bit less so. And even until today, if you enjoy bell bottoms and sparkle, then you are a fan of the Eurovision. But in 1978, Israel will win the Eurovision for the first time. And in 1979, on our home ground in Israel, Israel will win for a second time. It is unprecedented. And once again, Israel is showing the world, but more importantly, showing itself, we are equal amongst the nations. And this is what we won with.
Hallelujah, sing the song. Hallelujah, we follow along with a simple word, a single word. We bless the sky, the tree, the bird, and we fill our heart with joy. Hallelujah.
Everybody.
Hallelujah, sounds of love. Hallelujah, the sunshine above.
So once again, making a real impact on the world, but more importantly on ourselves. As our 1970s comes to a wrap, of course, with a little bit of a foray into 1980s, before we spoke about the peace agreement, which was ultimately signed in 79, but the returning of the Sinai was in steps all the way through 1984, 1985, when it was finally returned, or 83, 84, something along those lines, when it was completely. We also know that Anwar Sadat himself will be assassinated in 1981 by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt at a rally commemorating the victory in their minds of the October War. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, is the early incarnations of what would break away and also become and influence the establishment of the Hamas. But I'm getting ahead of myself a bit.
Hey, Ori, can I interrupt you for 1/2 second and tell you an unbelievable story about someone who is literally on this call right now?
Yeah.
At least I think she is. Maybe she's not. She was. But
Yes.
so we have a member of the congregation. Her name is Mary West, and her late husband, whose name was Steve West, is in the Army Corps of Engineers, and he was the lead in the delegation by the United States to take the Air Force bases that we lost in the Sinai Peninsula and rebuild those Air Force bases in Israel as part of the agreement between the United States and Israel and Egypt in giving back the Sinai Peninsula. So her late husband, Steve West, Colonel Steve West from the Army Corps of Engineers, was the one who led the delegation for building these two Air Force bases in Israel that America built. And I think she clearly stepped off the call, but it's something which is an amazing story. Yeah.
Great.
Sorry
Thank
for
you for
interrupting.
sharing. Thank you for sharing. 1981 would also be the year that Israel once again shows the world we are going to show the world that we will not rely on anyone else. If there's no one else to help us, we're going to take care of ourselves. And we see the beginning of what will be called the Begin Doctrine. If you take a look here at this note on the bulletin board, ultimately, Menachem Begin will give the order for a team of Israeli pilots with their F-15s and their F-16s, which we had recently begun to purchase from the United States, would fly over enemy territory and bombard and destroy the nuclear reactor that was being built by Saddam Hussein in Iraq. This also was unprecedented and unheard of. And when we do this, we're going to, of course, nothing new under the sun, and the entire world will chastise Israel for this act of war, including the United States, by the way. And Israel will make it very clear, we are not going to allow our neighbors to gain weapons of mass destruction to use against us. And we know they're going to use it because they've told us they're going to use it. The image of the young soldier that you see over there, the pilot, is actually Ilan Ramon, who was the youngest pilot in this formation. Successful endeavor. We're going to meet Ilan Ramon tragically later on, a couple of sessions down the road. Also in 1981, if you take a look for a second, oh, sorry. Oops. If you take a look for a second, you can see this guy over here with the tall hair and the Ponch Fonzarelli, the Ponch sunglasses. You can see my cultural references were frozen also in 1980 when I made Aliyah, is yours truly when my parents and my sister and I made Aliyah on August 12th, 1981. And my parents wanted us to have a powerful experience, informal education at its best. And we traveled for 3 weeks in Europe and then came over from Greece by boat. So we would see Haifa from the distance. So we would be able to see Israel the way my parents did when they first arrived in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. My mom especially, who came over by ship. But that's us. And more importantly, however, in 1982, and you can see at the bottom of the screen there, the bulletin that says that the Israeli ambassador to England was shot by a terrorist. Now, this terrorist is going to be, again, part of another outcropping group of the PLO, and the ambassador, Shlomo Argov. Shlomo Argov wouldn't die immediately. He would actually live out until about 2003 or so, but he will continuously be affected by the attack. And this will be the catalyst for what projects Israel into what would become known as the Lebanon War. But one other thing that's going on in the 1970s, so that we have a better understanding of this idea of the proverbial straw and camel's back, meaning it wasn't just that assassination attempt, but we can see here that throughout the 1970s, and I just took a sampling of 3 different attacks, that there's this ongoing terror that's happening across the border, primarily from Lebanon into Israel. Now, we've seen also outside of Israel and terrorists hijacking planes. We know that Yasser Arafat used to hijack planes and land them in Jordan. This was, by the way, one of the reasons that King Hussein was so angry at Yasser Arafat and led to the attacks against the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinians and the Palestinian army, the PLO, because they would force the planes to land in Jordan. And then after removing all of the travelers, they would blow the planes up. And this was a real slap across King Hussein. But these terrible, terrible acts of terror would follow us throughout the 1970s and the early 80s and onward, of course. But it would be all of this that propels Israel into Lebanon on June 5th, 1982. Now, this war officially was in order to push the terrorists north of the Litani River, and that was 40-kilometer range north of our border with Lebanon, so that the PLO would no longer have access to the border, which at the time was not a very significant barrier. And we were through having to try and storm kibbutzim and the children's homes where terrorists were held up, holding the children and the kibbutznikim hostage. Ariel Sharon is the Minister of Defense, and Menachem Begin is the Prime Minister, and they give the word to enter into Lebanon. Now, we enter into what becomes actually and figuratively the mud of Lebanon. As very soon on, we make our way all the way to Beirut, we conquer Beirut, we surround ourselves, there's terrible atrocities that are happening amongst those in Lebanon themselves. Sabra and Shatila, which were Palestinian refugee camps, would see a horrific massacre at the hands of Christian phalanges, these irregular militias of Christians in Lebanon who were attacking and killing the Palestinians. Israel would be blamed, and this would take a real toll on Menachem Begin. It took such a toll, by the way, that Ariel Sharon, in an inquiry that happened afterwards, it was deemed that he could never again be Minister of Defense. Prime Minister, yes, but not Minister of Defense. What started out to be known as the Operation for the Peace of Galilee, and when you call something an operation, it's a little bit more limited. That was the goal, is to give it a limited amount of time, but it turned into the Lebanon War and subsequently would be called the First Lebanon War. Now, what we saw born out of this Lebanon War, actually, it started already in the late 1970s, But what we saw was a movement called Peace Now that was born. And this movement called Peace Now was never, ever about the soldiers. It was never against the soldiers. It wasn't a replica of what America was going through in the late 60s, early 70s, when American GIs who were coming home from Vietnam were being attacked by civilians as if they were responsible for the horrors. And I'm not going to get into the American geopolitics, security, and political spectrum, but that was not this, because we are the army. These people, in between their stints of reserve duty, would also go ahead and protest in the streets to pull us out of Lebanon and to replace the government. Peace now. It exemplified a very serious divide within Israeli society, so much so that in February of 1983, Emil Greenswag, the guy in the center over here, would be killed by a grenade that was lobbed into a Peace Now rally by an Israeli who stood on the other side of the aisle, as it were. This idea of a divided Israel came out on many different levels for many, many years, including the early 2000s production, a movie called Waltz with Bashir, which was an animated movie. It's not a cartoon, but it was an animated movie that actually represented Israel at the Oscars. So we didn't win, but it was a very powerful read. And essentially, it's a journalist who has these empty pockets of memory about the war and goes on a journey to try and reclaim those pockets of memory. And it revolves around his time in Lebanon. And what I have on the screen right now, you can see on this little 1982 TV set that we have here, is a clip from the trailer for the movie. Now, there are subtitles. They're a little bit small, but hopefully you can read them.
תגיד, אתה אין לך אף פעם פלאשים מלבנון?
לא, לא ממש.
ואתה מזהה אותי פה משם?
לא. אני חושב שאתה תלך תברר מה קרה שם באמת. איך אתה קשור לזה.
This is not a love song. This is not a love song. This is not a love song. I'm crossing over. Not a love song. This is not a love song. This is
ולא נראה לך קצת מסוכן שאולי אני אגלה לעצמי דברים שאני לא רוצה
not a
לדעת?
love song.
פתאום בום, ונפתח לי הזיכרון מהמלחמה.
In many ways, I think this movie very much exemplified a trauma that Israel was going through then and throughout, and I think was a very powerful insight into another layer of who Israelis are. In fact, those demonstrations that took place by Peace Now was the first time that there were protests against a war in Israel during a war, and that it was felt that this is really the first time that we had a war that was not a war of no other choice. I mean, it wasn't an existential war, and therefore we should defend our borders from our borders and not have our young men, at the time mostly young men in Lebanon, dying on foreign soil. What you can see in the map, however, is you can see that at a certain point in 1986, Israel is going to pull out of most of Lebanon and then keep for itself here. You can see this yellowish area, or mustard-colored area, just north of the border between Israel and Lebanon, in an area that was between 4 and 6 kilometers or so into Lebanese territory, which was known as the Southern Lebanese Security Zone. And our goal was that we would stay there and stop terrorists who were trying to come in, so that the firefights would happen there and not in the children's homes of the kibbutzim, as I mentioned earlier. And many of us who were in combat roles at some point between 1982 and 2000 would find ourselves in southern Lebanon. And it was in 2000 that we pulled out of Lebanon. I think one other reflection on the Yom Kippur, on the First Lebanon War, can be exemplified by a song that was written in real time. And it was written by Ehud Manor, who is Israel's most profound lyricist, songwriter, really a poet. And he has up to about 1,000 poems, songs that he wrote himself or translated to his name. And among his iconic works was a song that was written in the aftermath of the beginning of the First Lebanon War. And when he writes this, he's actually writing it on two different levels. He's writing it on a national level because of his own understanding of the reality of the politics and security and geopolitics vis-a-vis his understanding of what Israel was meant to be, should be, and is, but also on a personal level, as he is still continuously reflecting on the death of his younger brother, Yehuda, who was killed during the War of Attrition back in 1968. He actually has one of his songs which is called Achi Hatzair Yehuda, my young brother Judah. But that experience also is influenced, he says later on, this song as well. And I think it would be important for us, if we want to understand a little bit about Israel at that time, that we listen to the words that were written by Ehud Manor. Music was created by Corinne Alal, and I believe this is Gali Atari who might be singing. I'm also going to get another glass of water while we listen.
אין לי ארץ אחרת, גם אם אדמתי בוערת, רק מילה בעברית חודרת, אלוקיי אל נשמתי, בגוף כואב, בלב רעב, כאן הוא ביתי. לא אשתוק כי ארצי שינתה את פניה, לא אוותר להזכיר לה ואשיר כאן באוזניה עד שתפקח את עיניה. אין לי ארץ אחרת, גם אם אדמתי בוערת, רק מילה בעברית חודרת, אלוקיי אל נשמתי.
Now, one of the things, and I think it exemplifies how powerful a song this was, is that on the one hand, it was written from the perspective of somebody who is against the actions of the government, who is against this incursion into Lebanon, or more importantly, against staying in Lebanon, because the goal was to push the terrorists north. And eventually we were able to push them north of the Litani River. And in fact, the PLO, who had been the adversary up until that point from Lebanon, was allowed to leave the country and set up shop in Tunisia. The idea was to get them out of here. That was the agreement that was made. As I mentioned, we get stuck in that mud, proverbial and actual, that will land us there until 2000. And of course, there's no such thing as a vacuum here in the Middle East. And we're going to see that that void would be filled, that terrorist void would be filled by no longer a secular Sunni terrorist organization, but by a religious Shiite Lebanese Arab terrorist organization called Hezbollah, Party of God. But what's so powerful about this song is that it was written from one particular political perspective and has been harnessed by multiple perspectives of political preference here in Israel. In fact, it has become an iconic song reflecting all Israelis, regardless of where they see the country going and coming from. And both sides, that is, if there are those on the left and those on the right, have harnessed it, because I think it is a reminder that we, on the one hand, of course, have sides. On the other hand, we're all informed by the same realities on the ground. We go through the same realities. We suffer the same pain. It's interesting to see how that same experience influences us one way or influences us another way. And actually, it's reached beyond our borders, because in the aftermath of January 6th, 2021 in the United States, Nancy Pelosi had a meeting with Chaim Herzog. Actually, the meeting took place earlier when he was still the head of the Jewish agency. And Chaim Herzog is going to share with her the words of Ehud Manor, which she will then produce in the aftermath of January 6th in the United States. And she quotes him, again, reflecting on her relationship with her country. But this, again, is part of that reality on the ground, that the First Lebanon War will very much be a monumental moment in the annals of our, not just history, but our consciousness as Israelis. One which, of course, we're going to talk about in depth as we get to our final sessions. As we heard earlier, those of you who were on a few minutes early heard Rabbi talk about the alerts that he was hearing of rockets that were landing in the north from Hezbollah. Everything is connected to everything. However, along with low points, we have high points. We are much more than just one particular geographic location. We go up, we go high, we go low, we go high. That is reality. And that includes Israel reaching beyond its borders in 1984 and what would be called Operation Moses. And that was the organized immigration of Jews out of Ethiopia. And you can see on the map exactly what we're talking about, but we do have to go back a little bit and talk about what are Jews doing in Ethiopia to begin with. And there's a couple of origin stories that Ethiopian Jews have, one of which was King Solomon's union with Queen of Sheba, who was traveling through and paying homage to the great King Solomon. And they exchange, well, let's just say there seemed to be more than an exchange of gifts between the two, because she leaves pregnant with his child, and hers, of course, and he, who will be born, will become ultimately the leader of what would be known as the Jews of Ethiopia, or Beta Israel, as they call their community. The other, however, which they're more likely to identify, is that in the aftermath of the expulsion of Jews, well, we have several different expulsions. We know that in 586, before the Common Era, the Babylonians will destroy all of Judah. That was the remainder, including the Holy Temple, and Jews will be dispersed to Babylon. But earlier on, in around 722, before the Common Era, Assyria, which is in the northeast of Israel today, where Syria more or less is today, swooped down and destroyed the 10 tribes that were living in the northern part of the kingdom of Israel. When these tribes disperse, they do disperse, one of the tribes, the tribe of Dan, will make his way down towards what was then called Cush, and today is Ethiopia. And that's where we're going to see the origin story of the Jewish population of Ethiopia begin, with the tribe of Dan. And what we're talking about, however, is what's happening in 1984. There is a dictatorship in Ethiopia. There's famine, there's civil war, there's anti-Semitism, and a decision has to be made of how do we save the Jews of Ethiopia. Before Israel can get involved, the first attempt is really internal. And what we see is the young man that you see on the left. He was a local director of a school in Ethiopia. His name was Ferede Aklum, a Jewish man who's going to go ahead and recognize that he has to find and see if he can connect with the Israeli Mossad to assist in the evacuation. Now, before anything happens, the Jews will have to evacuate themselves, and he sets out on foot from Ethiopia to Sudan, where he makes contact with the Israeli Mossad and eventually opens up a path along which the Jews can make their way. And they begin to make their way over the course of several weeks to several months. They make their way from Ethiopia to the refugee camps of Sudan. It was a devastating, devastating reality, one which of the 12,500 who make their way and leave Ethiopia on the footsteps of Feredi Aklum, who later becomes a Mossad agent himself, we know that only 7,500 will arrive. The rest will not survive, and they will die along the way of this modern day exodus, bona fide exodus. Then once they're in Sudan, a little bit of time goes by when we begin to see both air transport and also by sea, those Jews will be brought to Israel. Now, I think we have to be very careful in the language that we use, and that it's not that Israel saved the Jews of Ethiopia, but there was a partnership between the Jews of Ethiopia and the state of Israel, each from its own perspective. Israel wanting to reach out to Jews in dire straits and to help them, and the Jews of Ethiopia who had held on to a burning ember of an ancient 2,500-year yearning to return to the land of Israel. They continuously passed on from generation to generation to generation this desire to return to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, it was all about Jerusalem, and along this major exodus, there would be 4,000 who died on the way. This is just a news piece that was done about the operation known as Operation Moses in 1984, in which about 7,500, 8,000 Jews would arrive. When the actual operation stops, however, because it'll become public and eventually Sudan shuts down its borders to Jewish emigration from its borders after millions and millions of dollars changes hands to the Sudanese government to allow it. But this is what we're gonna, it's in Hebrew, but I'll read you the translation as we go.
לקחת את האנשים האלה, הם לא יודעים מי אתה, הם לא
You have to take
יודעים
these people, they don't know
לאן אתה
who you
לוקח
are
אותם.
or where you're taking them.
כשאנשים עצמם
When the people
מבינים
realize that they will,
שכשאני עולה על
when
כלי
they ascend
הרכב,
onto the vehicles,
אני
they are
יוצא מכאן,
leaving,
זאת אומרת,
they
אני
will live.
אחיה.
The feeling is that if we survived a month-long, difficult and dangerous journey on foot, the first thing you want to do to get there is to get there where you have been dreaming about, to reach Jerusalem. Yes, they were a type of statehood.
כן, זה סוג של מושיעים, מחלצים.
This is a story that is barely told, not just because there are Mossad agents and naval commando soldiers involved, because we're talking about Ethiopian Jewry. For some, it's difficult to open these wounds. This was theirs, exodus from Egypt, a forgotten piece of history. This was the commander of the ship. 25 years ago, the Mossad was given the mission to save the Jews of Ethiopia and bring them to Israel. This is Yonatan Shefa, Mossad agent. To work in that environment, you need to have a cover story. Without a cover story, they will ask you, where are you going? What are you doing here? Tourist? What is there to see here? Emmanuel Alon, advisor on a diving club in Sudan. Yonatan calls me and he says, listen, I need you for a special mission. This time something very special. No need to kill anybody this time. I'm telling you, he said, and I am moved with excitement. And then he says, I want to create a tourist resort in Sudan. A secret journey from Ethiopia to Sudan over thousands of kilometers. Escaping army patrols, thieves dealing with hunger, thirst, and illness. There, on one of the beaches, the Mossad agents opened a resort. Here every night, trucks with immigrants would arrive. From here, the naval commandos would pick them up in rubber boats and bring them to a Navy ship out in sea. From there, they would sail to Israel. It became a very popular destination for divers from Europe and around the world. During the day, it served as an authentic tourist resort. And at night, once a week, the commandos would bring their boats and we would make the connection.
מתקיימים מבצעים כשהשייטת מביאה את הסירות והחבר'ה לוקחים ומייצרים את המפגש הזה.
These are the only documented clips that present the Operation Moses. Commandos lead the immigrants to the Navy ship Bat Galim anchored at sea. This is Gabi Carl, commander of the commandos. We would fill the boats with children who had just been born. Through adults and elderly, we entered right away to the sea, and at times it was quite wavy. Not a word was said. This is Ricky Tagba, director of the nonprofit organization Hayut. This was a very difficult immigration. It was a small Holocaust for many people. Until today, there are many families that find it difficult to tell their story. Entire families that lost their family, and yes, it is a trauma. Until today, it is a very difficult. And if they tell it, it is accompanied by tears and a lot of emotion. One of those responsible to smuggle the immigrants from the Ethiopia-Sudan border to the shore was Mossad agent David Ben Uziel. That was the part that was the most dangerous, because we could have gotten caught. Because we were so close to the refugee camp, we had to finish that part very quickly. Into a small recorder, David Ben Uziel taped moments and emotions that is released here for the first time. Today, November 12th, we have begun an operation Is a Go. 11 boats are on their way to the ship full of our brothers and sisters. The boats arrived at the entrance of the ship. The sea is rough and we all hold each other so no one falls and drowns. The tensions are running high. Pass them out carefully, the loudspeaker says. No one gets left behind. The excitement amongst us is great. There are some of us who mentioned that these sites reminded them of the stories of their parents who came from different countries as illegal immigrants in the 40s, and they were on the verge of tears as they told us as they watched their brothers and sisters entering the ship. Last weekend, they all met, Mossad agents, naval commanders, representatives from the Ethiopian community, and the organization Hayut, which means life in Amharic. Hayut helps with the process of acclimatization into Israeli society. Operation Moses is not just the personal story of the Ethiopian community, but is a chapter in the history of the people of Israel. Now, I think it's important to understand, while this is an absolutely altruistic and incredible experience and something that Israel proves, this is one of the reasons we're here, to reach out beyond our borders to take care of our own. Today, we should know there is discrimination in Israel. There's racism in Israel, and this is horrific. And yet it's also a reality of a Western society, and I'm sure you know a few that have racism still embedded as part of who they are. In fact, every wave of immigration that came dealt with restrictions against them or discrimination against them, at least not officially, but on paper. And this was even more so with those Jews who arrived from Ethiopia. On the one hand, we're inviting them in, open arms, brothers and sisters, this is your home. And on the other hand, we still see this discrimination. Now, I'm saying that not to disparage Israel, but to recognize that we are a real living and breathing country with real issues. And also, we've come a very long way, and we are doing much better, even though as we go through the next couple of lessons, we'll talk about some highs and lows. We should say, however, that Israel is the only country in modern times, perhaps any time, that brought Africans to it to save them and not to enslave them. And that too needs to be said. And as we conclude our session today, I want to share with you the words of a young teenager by the name of Chaim Medicis, who wrote these words reflecting on his own experience of immigration during Operation Moses. And it was put to music by Shlomo Gronich, a very famous Israeli folk rock and singer and choir leader, who creates a choir of Israelis of Ethiopian descent to sing the words written by young Chaim. And with these words, we will have insight of their experience. And my mama promises me, my little brothers, a bit more, a little more. Lift your legs, a final effort before Jerusalem. And I promise my little brothers, just a moment, a little more. The dream will be fulfilled. Soon we will arrive to the land of Israel. This reality, as expressed by this young boy, of course, turned into music by the choir, I think is a reflection of a deep emotional, almost visceral connection with the land of Israel that these Ethiopian Jews held for 2,500 years. And that exemplified itself by having the wherewithal, the ability to go to Jerusalem. Now, the fact that that reality did not necessarily line up to the perspective that they had is, well, nothing new under the sun of every wave of immigration that came here, because every wave of immigration that came here, for the most part, came under duress, and it was overnight. And Israel changed its demographics overnight. Think of other countries that you know that have changed its demographics over hundreds and hundreds of years. You still face challenges. Israel even more so. And yet, as I said, here is another example of Israel reaching beyond its borders to take care of its own. And also, here is a group of dedicated, devoted Jews to the Jewish peoplehood that they were brought up on, knowing that one day they would return. So 1980s is going to provide for us both those challenging points and these high points. And as we see next lesson, we will see other challenging points that will be lifted by other incredible, momentous Olympuses that will find ourselves crashing down again, and throughout a thread that will drive us through post-2000 in those moments where we rise to the occasion, even in the midst of a very real reality playing out with incredible moments and challenging moments, because that is a real living and breathing country and not a fairy tale land. But all of that we'll do in our next class.
Bravo. Bravo. Fascinating. Once again, fascinating, another fascinating element and chapter of Israel's history. I want to just emphasize something that Hannah mentioned in the chat, and that is, if you're interested in what Uri was talking about with respect to the rescue or the assistance in bringing the Ethiopian Jews to Israel, there is a fabulous movie on Netflix called Red Sea Diving Resort. It stars Chris Evans, who was, I think, Captain America in the Marvel's movies, but it's really, really excellent, and it does a great job of describing that really kind of unique and remarkable element of history. So Red Sea Diving Resort on Netflix. Anyway, Uri, thank you so much, my friend. Feel better. We feel like we were vicariously experiencing your cold, and we were just taking joy and pleasure in the fact that we weren't needing to sip on tea quite as often as you are. Hope that that this passes quickly for you, and you enjoy what appears to be a lovely day outside. Not like I needed to look out your window to know what the weather is like in Israel during the summer. My guess is cloudless and warm. But nonetheless, it's really great to see you again, and we hope you rest up in anticipation. Although I think you may have another session coming up later today. But nonetheless, thank you so much, and we'll see everybody on Wednesday for our next session.
Thank you, everyone. Be well.